I myself am a former pro fighting game player.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Darkside Phil here, and welcome to something very different. Something that normally I would not do. But I'm a lifelong lifelong player, and fan of the Street Fighter franchise is what I meant to say. Although I guess I am a viewer too, because I certainly spent hundreds of hours watching people play Street Fighter in arcades. But also I grew up playing the Street Fighter franchise in actual physical arcades in the United States of America. Since the day that it was released in 1991 until basically arcades kind of died in the early to mid 2000s, I was the person right there in line with my quarter up on the machine, ready to play in person every single weekend, just loving the Street Fighter franchise. You know, Street Fighter created an entire genre of games with fighting games, competitive fighting games. Up to then, there had been other games, including combat games and beat-em-ups, but nothing that was really a head-to-head competitive game. And in fact, what we're going to do today, as I go through what I like to call DSP's history of Street Fighter, is we're going to explore the various different iterations of the Street Fighter II franchise from that first decade that it existed. And what you're going to see is that the original game was not even a competitive fighting game at all. Wait till you see how different Street Fighter, or as it was originally called, Fighting Street, was from what it would eventually become as the franchise evolved, and all the different gameplay changes and character tweaks and gameplay mechanics that were added over the years, and the franchise changed dramatically, adding in all these different core different elements that became a part of fighting games pretty much forever. You know, footsies, reactionary moves, reversals, anti-airs, combo, all these things originated from the Street Fighter II series in the 1990s. Alright, but before we even get to anything like that, we've got to start where it all began with the original Street Fighter. As I said, it actually was called Fighting Street, and it wasn't until certain territories or certain distributions of the game that they changed the name to Street Fighter to sound a little better. What a game this game is, let me tell you. You're going to see, because we're about to play it, it's very different from what you think Street Fighter is. Released in August of 1987 on a JAMA board, which is actually, it's the description of the hardware used to run the software, okay? This game had two different versions. In one version, it had a layout very similar to traditional Street Fighter, where there were 6 buttons, 3 punches, 3 kicks, and a joystick. In another version, and this was actually the version that I played on at a local arcade that I used to go to, it had 2 buttons. 2 giant buttons. I mean, probably about, I'd say, this big. They were ginormous buttons, and they would glow. And what you would do is you would tap the button lightly to do a light attack. You would kind of press it normally to do a medium, and you would slam the button hard to do a heavy attack. Now, obviously, in a competitive game, do you really want that? No, you're not going to be able to get accurate inputs or whatever. So, obviously, this was not that kind of game. This was very similar to, say, games like, think Final Fight, or other kind of side-scrolling beat-em-ups of the time that were very popular in arcades. But you're going to see it's really not like that. It was kind of unique. Quite frankly, the game wasn't well received like original Street Fighter II and other versions were later on. It was kind of just a game that was there, and you would pump it a quarter, play it, and then move on. Alright, it wasn't a game that, oh man, people lined up to play it or anything like that. And I think what Capcom did is they went back to the drawing board with Street Fighter 2 and redesigned it. But before we get to Street Fighter 2, let's do Street Fighter. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, continuing on with my history of Street Fighter. Up next, after that original really weird iteration of Street Fighter 1, also known as Fighting Street, several years later, as you can see, there was a 4-year gap nearly, more 3.5 years. Capcom decided to release a new game called Street Fighter 2 on a whole new hardware system called the CP System JAMA, or CPS-1. It was actually the CPS system of arcade hardware that would fuel all of the future Street Fighter games in arcades all the way up till 1999, until finally they started switching over to new hardware around that later time. Street Fighter 1, as you're going to see, very, 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 very different from the original Street Fighter. A wide variety of characters, 8. That was the most amount of selectable characters in any arcade game ever at the time. No other arcade game will let you choose from 8 different characters at all. So just the wide variety and selection. The fact that the characters were very different. They weren't just like palette swaps, right? They were actually, different design characters. You had the American Air Force guy with Guile, the sumo wrestler in Honda. They're very, very different. 6 buttons, all of which did different strengths of attacks. Throws for the first time were implemented because they didn't exist in the original Street Fighter. Rapidly touch special moves for the first time ever implemented. In the original Street Fighter, it was motions. In this game, it was rapid touch. Charge moves for the first time. Holding back in one direction, then pushing another plus a button. First game ever to have charge moves in them. It's pretty much a plethora of firsts. The Dizzy system, first game it's ever been in. So, pretty damned awesome. Alright, and only 3... Alright, so we're moving on from the original Street Fighter now to Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. What's the difference? Well, primarily the major difference is that they added in the 4 boss characters to the game as playable characters. Everyone in the original Street Fighter was so upset you couldn't play as the bosses even though they were in the game. Everyone thought, oh, there's a code to get the bosses, you know. But no, it was all a rumor, and there was no real bosses in the original game, or no playable bosses in the original game. So Champion Edition did a few things. Number 1, tick throws became huge, as certain boss characters like Bison would do like walk up short into like a throw, or just like low jab into throw. That was one of the things. And some of the boss stuff like Bison in particular, I'm going to play as Bison. He is incredibly overpowered compared to the rest of the cast. Also, Sagat in this is very overpowered because his Tiger Uppercut does tons of damage, and he has variable speed fireballs that make him a zoning beast. So, alright, let's do Champion Edition. Alright, welcome back. What we're going to do now is check out Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting or Street Fighter 2 Turbo, depending on where you were, what territory you lived in. It was called something different. Now, some interesting trivia. The original Street Fighter 2 was ported to the Super NES, as well as the Sega Genesis, I believe. No, I take that back. I think it was only on Super NES. It wasn't until the next... Yeah, that's right. The original Street Fighter 2 was only ported to Super NES. However, it was not very similar to the real game. In fact, the sprites were different, the hitboxes were different. The game essentially was a different game. Although it looked and sounded like Street Fighter 2, it played a lot differently. The Genesis couldn't handle it at the time. The Genesis got a version called Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, but it wasn't. It was actually a combination of Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting. Then the Super NES got Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, which was basically a sped-up version of the original World Warrior with different move properties, but again, was not the original arcade versions. All the ports, the home versions of the games at this time were very inferior to the arcade versions because home consoles weren't as powerful as this CPS system that was used in arcades. So although they had similar gameplay mechanics, they were not identical. Okay. Alright, so anyway, let's move on. Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. In America, this was called Street Fighter 2 Turbo. That's what I called it. It was Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I never called it Hyper Fighting. And it was weird because the marquee, you know, the glass that would go up on the arcade cabinets said Street Fighter 2 Turbo. But then the game itself on the title screen would say Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. And you'd be like, what's the name of the game, right? You'd be a little confused. I guess it actually was called Hyper Fighting, but for some reason they branded it differently in the Americas, and then later on everyone called it the right thing. Alright, so what are the major changes? Number 1, more color changes. Number 2, the speed. The speed of Super Turbo, or excuse me, of Street Fighter 2 Turbo is so much faster than the previous 2 Street Fighter games because people demanded more speed. They said, man, these games are so slow-paced, we'd like a more fast-paced game. Because the speed was changed, so many new combos were now available with every character. Even Zangief, who previously got like no combos, now has like 4 or 5 hit combos in this game that make the game really interesting. Special move properties were completely changed. So for example, Honda's underhand slap now moves forward when he does it, which by the way is incredibly cheap. Other characters got brand new moves. Chun-Li got her first very odd-looking fireball in this game. The bosses in this game didn't get too much changed about them, which is weird, because almost everyone else in the game gets like a new special move or a new property. Like, Ryu and Ken can now do aerial hurricane kicks. And Ryu and Ken's hurricane kicks are completely different, where Ryu still knocks down with 1 hit, Ken is multiple hits, and it combos for a juggle. Zangief got a fast spinning clothesline. But Guile and the bosses don't get anything new, which is so odd. Like, why did some characters get new moves and other characters didn't? Very bizarre, right? Alright, anyway. Alright, so ladies and gentlemen, continuing on with the history of Street Fighter here, alright? From Hyper Fighting to Super Street Fighter 2, there were positives and negatives. The positives, 4 new characters, okay? And some gameplay elements were tweaked, having 4 new characters, new locations. The hardware, if you take a look here, moved from the CPS-1 system to the CPS-2. Now, the CPS-2 system ended up being incredibly popular. It housed games such as Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Turbo, as well as the entire Alpha series, plus a lot of other Capcom-style games were also CPS-2. So it was a big generation of games. I think it spanned like 3 or 4 years that games were still coming out for CPS2, okay? Because the hardware upgraded, the graphics look better. In fact, the characters from Super Street Fighter 2, you'll notice they have more detail than the original characters because now this new hardware can handle it. And the music, this game, the music started using what was called Q sound, which is almost a virtual surround sound system, and it would make this amazing like audio experience in the arcade. I remember walking into an arcade and watching people play this on T-Hawk State, and you could hear the song echoing through the whole arcade. It sounded amazing. It's like, wow, this is so much better than the old school kind of really mono shitty sounding music. I think this was the first Street Fighter game that fully had stereo sound. So, all right, so here we go. Moving on from 1992 to now October 1993, it's Super Street Fighter 2, The New Challenger. Okay, everyone, continuing on in our history of Street Fighter, this is the big one for me. The one we're about to explore, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, is the game that personally I like the best out of every Street Fighter game ever made. It's the epitome of the gameplay elements that were all balanced upon, improved upon, and created in the Street Fighter 2 series. Incidentally, it's also the final game in the Street Fighter 2 series, released in March of 1994. Yes, it was still on that CPS2 system. What did Super Turbo add that the other games didn't have? Number one, super moves. It actually had, every character had a super move that never before had that been existing. You build up a super meter depending on how many hits you land or how many times you get hit. Once the meter fills up, you're able to do a super move that has invincibility properties, big flashy graphics, right? You had the shadows on the screen. First time you ever saw anything like that in a fighting game. And they could deal monstrous damage, especially if you could find a way to combo them in a lot of cases, okay? In addition, this game also had tech throws. What that means is when someone tries to throw you, you can do what's called a technical hit or technical escape by pressing forward and a button. You can reduce the damage the throw does, and instead of being grounded by the throw, you could like pop up after the throw and kind of land in a more advantageous position. So it's a lot better than previously. Up to now, whenever you got thrown, you lost a ton of damage and were always in a bad position. This game in particular also introduced Akuma for the very first time as a secret boss level character. He's only selectable via a special code on the character select screen, but outside of that, he's a special boss. If you beat the entire game without dying or losing, you'll get Akuma at the end. He beats up Bison and comes out as a secret final boss. I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll see. We'll play it by ear, but we'll see if I get him. If not, it's okay. There's other things too. Definitely the game speeds up in speed from Super Street Fighter 2 to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Basically, it was kind of like from Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition to Hyper Fighting, how the game sped up. They sped the game up again because the people were complaining that Super Street Fighter 2 was far too slow of a game. So they sped the game up, supers, tech hits, and air juggles. This is the very first Street Fighter game to have air juggles. So certain characters like M. Bison or Ryu can do jumping medium punch and cause a juggle state in the air, and afterward they can juggle moves. DJ has his upward kicks. I believe that they're called the upwards blade kicks. He could juggle those into each other or juggle into his own super. So first time you could ever do that in a Street Fighter game. Before then, it was just basic combos, no juggles. Now juggles are in effect. Okay, so a lot of changes. A lot of changes. Let's do this.